And so we're at lecture 4, guys, and I'm continuing the dive in lecture 4 into the consequences of evil. So you should have a sheet before you there that talks about 3 basic issues that I'll get into this time. And then hopefully by tomorrow we're ready for resurrection. So firstly, I want to talk about slavery in 2 forms, previous forms and present day forms. Secondly, I want to talk about censorship. And thirdly, I want to talk about woke. So that's where I go this afternoon. I'm sure most of you, who are raised Jewish or Christian, which is probably 99% of us, are aware of the great story in the book of Genesis about this extraordinary character called Joseph, the son of Jacob. He was Jacob's 12th son. This visionary who had these great dreams and who was his father's favorite because he was the youngest son at that stage. And he made him this great multicolored tunic. And then you know the story about how his brothers were jealous of him and they sold him into slavery in Egypt. And when he was in Egypt, he became known as a dream interpreter. And at one stage, Pharaoh had a dream that nobody could interpret for him. And they were told there was this great, dream interpreter called Joseph. So Pharaoh says, bring him, see if he can interpret my dream. And the dream was that Pharaoh dreamt that he saw 7 really fat cows coming up out of the Nile, really, really fat cows, followed by 7 really, really skinny, emaciated cows. And the 7 emaciated cows killed and ate the 7 fat cows. And nobody could interpret the dream for him. So he brought in Joseph, and Joseph says, yes, I can tell you what it's about. There are going to be 7 great years of plenty in the land of Egypt, great, great harvests. And then they're going to be followed by 7 famine years, which will devour all the seeds and the food of the 7 previous years. And so what you need to do is, build big storehouses and store the excess from the first 7 years so there will be food for the next 7 years. And so Pharaoh set him in charge of this. And so you think then this is a beautiful story where this really compassionate dream interpreter is going to save the people from famine. Unfortunately, there's not a very pretty ending to the story. And you're never going to hear it read in church. And I read it actually a few weeks ago for you in church, but I guarantee you didn't hear it in the Sunday masses you attended. And it's from chapter 47 of the book of Genesis, verses 13 to 26. So the famine is now raging in the land of Egypt and in Canaan. And here's the reading. Since there was no food in all the land because of the extreme severity of the famine, and the lands of Egypt and Canaan were languishing from hunger, Joseph gathered in, as payment for the grain that they were buying, all the money that was to be found in Egypt and Canaan, and he put it in Pharaoh's house. When all the money in Egypt and Canaan was spent, all of the Egyptians came to Joseph pleading, give us food. Why should we perish in front of you, for our money is gone? Give me your livestock if your money is gone, replied Joseph, and I will give you food in return for your livestock. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and he gave them food in exchange for their horses, their flocks of sheep, and herds of cattle, and their donkeys. Thus, he supplied them with food in exchange for all their livestock in that year. That year ended, and they came to him in the next one and said, we cannot hide from my lord that with all our money spent and all our livestock made over to my lord, there is nothing left to put at my lord's disposal except our bodies and our land. Why should we and our land perish before your eyes? Take us and our land in exchange for food, and we will become Pharaoh's slaves, and our land his property. Only give us seed that we may survive and not perish, and that our land may not turn into a waste. So Joseph acquired all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. Each of the Egyptians sold his field, since the famine weighed heavily upon them. Then the land passed over to Pharaoh, and the people were reduced to slavery from one end of Egypt's territory to the other. Only the priest's land Joseph did not acquire. Since the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived off the allowance Pharaoh had granted them, they did not have to sell their land. Joseph told the people, now that I've acquired you and your land for Pharaoh, Here is your seed for sowing the land. But when the harvest is in, you must give 1/5 of it to Pharaoh, while you keep 4/5 as seed for your fields and as food for yourselves and your households and as food for your children. You have saved our lives, they answered. We have found favor with my Lord. Now we will be Pharaoh's slaves. Thus, Joseph made it a statute for the land of Egypt, which is still in force, that 1/5 of its produce should go to the Pharaoh. Only the land of the priests did not pass over to Pharaoh. Now you know the rest of the story. So I want to talk then about slavery in its previous forms and in its current forms. And firstly, to say that slavery is as old as life on planet Earth. And by life on planet Earth, I don't just mean human life on planet Earth, I mean life on planet Earth. There are varieties of plants that practice slavery. We call them parasites. I've got them in my land up here. Mistletoe. Mistletoe attaches particularly to the oak trees in this area and sucks the life out of them, contributing nothing to the tree, but taking everything that it needs from the tree. There are some species of ants that enslave other species of ants and literally milk them for food. Matriarchal societies practiced slavery. In the Hebrew scriptures, the word slave is used over 1,000 times, but very typically it's translated into English as a servant. In the New Testament, the Greek word doulos, meaning a slave, is used about 150 times, but it is rarely translated as a slave. Mostly is translated as a servant. In 5th century BCE, Athens, there were reckoned to be about 80,000 slaves. And the brilliant Aristotle considered that not only was it necessary to have slaves, but it was natural to have slaves. In the Roman Empire, in Rome of 100 BCE, about 30% of the population were enslaved. And then we come to our own country and we look at our tradition on slavery, where farmers in the southern part of our country particularly owned African slaves. Now, as we understand this slavery in our country and elsewhere, it is very important for us that we really understand what slavery actually meant in our country. And so slavery could not have happened unless there were 5 phases to it. And the first phase is that tribal conflict in Africa, particularly in West Africa, particularly around the Ivory Coast and Sierra Leone, tribal conflict resulted in the winners taking slaves, selling them to slave traders, who were transported them across the Atlantic, who were bought by retailers, who then gave them to the quote-unquote end users, who were the farmers. It's the equivalent of, inner city kids who are drug addicts, and they're being fed the drugs by dealers. And the dealers are getting their supplies from cabals that are coming across the border from Mexico, and they're buying it from the producers. So every stage of this process is necessary. And every stage of this process was necessary in order for slavery to thrive. It wasn't just the farmers in the southern part of our country who were guilty for the slave trade. African chieftains in West Africa are responsible. The traders, the slave traders who bought them from those African chiefs are responsible. The ship captains who transported them across the Atlantic are responsible. The retailers who took possession of them here and then sold them to the individual farmers, all of those people are responsible. So to understand the slave trade, it is not enough just to look at the end user. You got to look at all the stages which were necessary and all of those who were culpable in this trade. So in 1803, the Dutch were the first group to ban transatlantic slave trade. Followed in 1807 by Britain, it banned transatlantic slave trade. In 1808, the United States banned it. Now, the British and the Americans actually stationed naval warships off the west coast of Africa to try to intercept this slave trade. And it led to African chieftains on West Africa getting really, really upset at this loss of income. And there were several battles fought in Sierra Leone between naval troops of the American and British ships and local African tribespeople who were really upset that their income was being disrupted. So in order to understand the slave trade, all of these people need to take responsibility for what happened. Now, we've tended to focus on the end user, and certainly they're guilty, white Christians in the southern part of this country quoting scripture to justify the enslavement of black Africans. It's also important to realize that it was white Christians in our country who stopped the slave trade. And in fact, it was white male Christians. 300,000 of them gave their lives to stop the slave trade in our country. So in order to understand slavery in our own country, we need to appreciate all of these facets of it. Because if we are to end modern slavery, we need to look at all the facets that go in to creating slavery in our times. So I want to talk then about present day forms of slavery. It was really, really upsetting to me when I first came across this story in Genesis chapter 47. And the part of that really upset me most was that the enslaved people regarded Joseph as their savior. My Lord, you have saved us. You know, you've taken our land, our money, our livestock, our persons, but you've given us food. Thank you that we have found favor with you. And Joseph was passing it on to the Pharaoh. Now, this did not begin with Joseph. This system is as old as humans are. It's as old as oligarchy. So it goes through typically 4 stages, this process of ancient slavery and modern slavery. The first stage is that you either harvest a naturally occurring crisis or you create an artificial crisis through some kind of a false flag operation, creating pandemonium for the public. And then you use the mass media to create panic for the situation in which the populace finds itself. And then they begin, number 3, screaming for solutions. Somebody save us from this situation. And finally, the oligarchy reluctantly steps in and says, okay, now that you've kind of asked us and in fact forced us, we'll take charge of the situation. There'll be a price for this. And the price is the temporary loss of freedoms of various kinds, loss of civil rights. But this is only temporary. As soon as the crisis is over, we'll give you back all your civil liberties. This happens again and again and again and again. Wherever you get a tyrant, wherever you get an oligarchy, you're going to see the same version happening again and again. So you're looking at slavery in various ways. Now, if I were a despot, if I were a modern day despot, and I had a vision of becoming the arch tyrant of planet Earth to control humanity, I would be hard pressed to come up with a better model than what we're seeing in the present day lockdown in our country and in our world. I would shut down religion so people couldn't have access to God or to liturgy. I would make people cover their identities so their sense of self is diminished, where it is fearful to see somebody with a mask and it's even more fearful to see somebody without a mask. I would create a system where I would encourage people to snitch on their neighbors, to phone in and say such and such a person is not conforming to whatever restrictions are being implied. I would oversee what has become in the year 2020 the greatest transfer of wealth in the history of the human species from ordinary people to the oligarchy. Literally, economists are telling us it is the greatest transfer of wealth in the history of planet Earth from ordinary working people to the oligarchs at the top. Millions and millions of American people just in our own country out of work. The small mom and pop situations going under while the Walmarts can keep their doors open. I would try to create an escalation of suicide, of anxiety, of depression, of domestic violence, of spousal abuse, of drug addiction, and elderly people dying alone. And I would co-opt the mass media to make sure that this panic stays center stage all the way down. And I would shut down all other perspectives, talking about other data and other possibilities with dealing with this epidemic. And finally, I would create the mark of the beast, some kind of a visa or a card, that allows me to go shopping or go to the cinema or travel on an airplane. I couldn't think of a better system of actually closing down planet Earth and creating slavery for our times. Now, as I investigate all sides, the mass media and other types of media, I'm trying to find out what the data are about this situation. What's really interesting to me is that the mass media are telling us this is a health concern. And indeed it is. There is a real virus out there that is killing people. It is a health concern. Are they not concerned about the other health ramifications? The fact that, not only just our physical health, our social health, our psychological health, our spiritual health, and the consequences of a lockdown for all that kind of health. And you never see the slave masters addressing the other health consequences. They focus merely on the physical. You will never hear them talking about the economic consequences or the psychological consequences or, God forbid, the spiritual consequences of this. And when I look at the alternative, those who have managed to avoid censure and have managed to get their message out, one of the things that really amazes me and gives me courage and hope is that they all talk about the spirituality, of the lockdown and the spirituality of censorship. The others are talking only about physical well-being, physical survival. They have no interest whatsoever in our psychological well-being, in our spiritual well-being, or in economic well-being. It's just allegedly keeping us alive. So we're going through a period of modern-day slavery. And that's brings me to my second point, the censorship of alternative perspectives about the situations in which we find ourselves. Martin Niemöller was a German Lutheran pastor and theologian born in 1892. And he supported Adolf Hitler's rise to power initially, until at some stage Hitler insisted the supremacy of the state over religion. And at this stage, Niemöller could see what was happening and he began to object. He became the leader of a group of German clergymen who were opposed to Hitler and what Hitler was doing. And so in 1937, he was arrested and eventually spent time confined in 2 different concentration camps. He survived the war. And upon his release, he continued in his career as a clergyman, as the leading voice of penance and reconciliation. And he said he was deeply ashamed of the cowardice of German intellectuals and German clergy in following the Nazi rise to power and the incremental purging of chosen targets, group after group after group. And he very famously said in several of his lectures, and I'm going to read this for you, he said, "They first came for the communists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Catholics, and I didn't speak up because I was a Protestant. Then they came for me, and by that time, there was nobody left to speak up." And that's a kind of a synopsis of what censorship looks like and what the beginning of despotism and tyranny, and slavery begins to look at. And so I want to do a very, very quick look at how censorship always becomes the beginning, the foundation on which slavery is built. You can go way back into the ancient empires, and you come across people who are known as, in the literature, as court historians. There were historians, allegedly, whose job it was to praise the ruling, royal family. Never to talk about the excesses of their power, to talk about, the great things they had done. And they're known in the literature as court historians, not real historians who are looking, at the entire data field, but only selecting out information that's going to make the rulers look good. They're called court historians. You've got the very, very same thing in religions, and they're known as the false prophets. The prophets who want to tell the rulers of the time things that the rulers of the time want to hear. But the real prophets, get punished and persecuted. The Jeremiahs who are talking about the coming fall of Jerusalem because of the alliance between the southern kingdom of Judah and the Egyptians at the time. And Jeremiah is saying, you have to trust in God. You can't trust in military alliances. And he's regarded as a danger, and he's taken out of circulation. You get the very same thing in the Catholic Church, where dissident voices are subject to inquisitions, and which they create this thing called the Index. I don't know if you remember it. It was still in vogue when I was a child. The Index was a list of forbidden books that Catholics were not allowed to read. Now, in actual fact, they should have put the Bible on that list as well, because Catholics were discouraged from reading the Bible. That was for Protestants. Us Catholics don't need the Bible. We don't need the Bible because we have an infallible Pope leading us. And so you get a whole index of books, and some of the books on this list are ludicrous. Catholics were not allowed to read these books under pain of mortal sin. So there you got kind of the censorship. You got Germany of the time of Hitler literally having public book burnings. You have Russia, shutting down, and deporting people to the Gulag for standing up to what was happening. You got China under Mao Zedong, and you got current day China under CCP issuing kinds of social credit cards where you can't go shopping or have an education or get housing unless you're an obedient citizen. And now we have the assault in our own country on the First Amendment. We have the cancel culture. And we literally have big tech holding a mute button on American news. They literally have a mute button that they can just totally silence any dissenting voice on any topic which is important to the people of America. We're beginning to live in a surveillance state. The internet is such that this great gift of the internet that now we can be spied from outer space, literally from outer space. The technology is such that satellites can beam in on a single human being standing on a street corner, lighting a cigarette. They can focus in on the tip of the cigarette. We've got facial recognition software that can scan an entire crowd of people, 10,000 people, and pick out individual faces and go and arrest them if they're demonstrating against something that we think they shouldn't be demonstrating against. So that was the internet. Then is coming the Internet of Things. And this is where smartphones and meters and fridges and television sets are listening to our conversations in our homes and relaying that information back to huge big data banks that can be used against us. The next stage is going to be called the Internet of Bodies. And this is the implantation of devices within the human system that are literally monitoring our thought processes and allowing us to be hacked by some kind of a master controller. And so finally, we're looking at a phase of human robots where hacking our minds and controlling our thinking is technically possible. We're moving into a transhumanist stage, which was predicted in the book of Revelation. I'd call it the mark of the beast there. So here is the America in which we're living, and here is the world in which we're living right now. Censorship is always the first stage in the abolition of human rights and the beginning of slavery. One of my favorite authors is a guy called Dave Rubin, and he said famously one time, free speech is the ultimate disinfectant for bad ideas. Free speech is the ultimate disinfectant for bad ideas. If you want to, get rid of bad ideas, the best way to do it is free speech and allow people to hear the ridiculous notions and then say, I couldn't subscribe to that. But you shut it down and you don't allow dialogue, then even bad ideas begin to promulgate and fester as well. That's my second point. And the third point, I want to look at the woke culture. I personally, I've lived in the States for almost 34 years now. I am absolutely shocked and dismayed at what's been happening in our country in the last few years with this kind of woke mentality. I've watched every facet of American life get weaponized. I've seen sex get weaponized. I've seen gender get weaponized. I've seen the family get weaponized. I've seen race get weaponized. I've seen politics get weaponized. I've seen culture get weaponized. I've seen class distinctions get weaponized. I've seen nations get weaponized against each other. And I've seen even history itself get weaponized. And my contention is you can't create a better future by destroying evidence of the past any more than you can attempt to create better branches on a tree by cutting off its root system. We grow from our roots and our trunks and we develop, and we shed what's not of value to us. That is how cultures evolve. So today, as I sit here, according to the wokesters that I'm reading, i.e. Sean O'Leary, I have 5 strikes against me. Because in this incarnation, I'm white, I'm male, I'm heterosexual, I'm a follower of Jesus Christ, and I'm a Catholic priest. I've got 5 strikes against me right now, as far as the wokesters are concerned. I make no apology for being who I am in this incarnation. I've been in the other positions in previous incarnations. I've been female, I've been gay, I've been Jewish, I've been Muslim in past incarnations. I've been a genius, I've been mentally retarded in past incarnations. I've been in all those places. I'm not identified with being white and male and straight and Catholic and a priest at this stage. But this is who I am in this incarnation. This is what I chose to do for this particular mission. If I were a person of color, whatever that means, and I were female, and if I were transgender, and if I were atheist, and if I were militantly anti-Christian, I'd be the darling of the mob whose claim to virtue is their victim identity. So I want to give a quick little history to the Walksters. Our country, the United States of America, has been a shining light since 1776. It initiated the first great experiment in democracy. They had toyed with it in ancient Greece. But this is the first country that really created a constitution which it was the first great attempt at a republic which was democratic. And of course, we had our faults. In the 245 years since then, we have been slowly trying to get to work the kinks out of the system, to kind of, recognize that women were entitled to vote, that Black Americans were Americans entitled to all of their freedoms, that Native American Indians had an extraordinary culture and that they were here before the rest of us arrived and they had various rights. So over the last 240 years, we've been trying diligently, to legislate, those improvements into America. America has granted more freedoms than any other country in the history of the world. There is not a country anywhere in the world at any stage of human history which has granted more freedoms to its citizens than have been granted to us as citizens of the United States. We are the only country to enact an Emancipation Proclamation. In 1862, Abe Lincoln created, an executive order of emancipation. We are the only country that fought a war and in which white Christian males, 300,000 of them in the North, gave their lives in order to free the slaves. It was white Christians who spearheaded the abolitionist movement, the Quakers. And there is no country in the world which has done more to encourage immigration from all parts of the world. People from every culture, from every tribe, and from every nation have come here and are thriving here, myself included. There are 130 different languages spoken in Silicon Valley alone. In the 2010 census, 13.5% of Americans, that's 1 in 7, are foreign born. And the latest numbers, we call it diversity, of the 535 members of Congress, 116 of them are people of color. There has never been a greater representation of the non-white population. So when the Walksters begin to preach, and tear down our monuments, tear down the statues of people whose feet they're not fit to lick, who have contributed nothing to our society except to tear down and create slogans. It has been, Walksters have substituted slogans, for dialogue, dogma for discussion, offensive, simplistic slogans for serious, respectful discussion, name calling for listening, censorship for multiple perspectives. They have introduced shaming, hateful slogans causing good people to cower into submission in their homes, afraid to speak what their views are. If you are a parent who willfully creates self-doubt and self-hatred and shame in your child, you're going to cause that child, their personality, to implode. At best, they're going to have anxiety and depression, and at worst, they're going to commit suicide. You cannot be a parent and do that to your child. And any movement that willfully creates self-doubt, self-hatred, and shame in a culture is going to cause that culture to implode. You're going to end the greatest experiment in democracy that this world has ever seen if you buy into being shamed by these people, these Walksters. Fundamentalism always has 4 stages, whether you see it in religious organizations, political systems, economic models, or whatever it is. It always goes through 4 stages. The first stage is you reduce a very complex situation to simplistic bumper stickers that you stick on your car. The second stage is you either identify an enemy or you create an enemy. The third stage is you dehumanize the enemy whom you have created. And then fourthly, you release the dogs of war on the enemy and destroy them. And one of the main focuses of this effort on behalf of the Walksters is the assault on the family and on family values. The single most important institution in a stable society is an intact 2-parent family. And it comes in a few different guises. It can be a nuclear family with the parents and the children, or it can be a multi-generational family with the kids, the parents, the grandparents, and sometimes even the great-grandparents. or it can be an extended multi-generational family that also includes, as well as parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, aunts and uncles and cousins. That is the single most important institution in any stable community. And the most devastating weapon I'm seeing right now is a cultural effort to break up the family unit. Family is the glue that held Africa together. Family is the glue that held Asia together. Family is the glue that held Europe together. And family is the glue that held the Americas together. It allowed all these peoples, all these cultures of all these continents to survive all the great upheavals of human history, whether it was wars or famines or pandemics. And now we're witnessing a concerted effort to destroy this institution. There's a sociology professor at New York State University whose name is Jessie Daniels, and she has claimed, and I quote her, "The white nuclear family is one of the most powerful forces supporting white supremacy." And her solution, and I'm quoting her again, "Forming a white family and having white children perpetuates racism." This is a sociology professor at New York City University. And this is what our kids are being brought up with. And is any wonder then that there's this wokester mentality? In actual fact, the data show very, very strongly that when you have fatherless families, the kids are much more likely to commit suicide. They're much more likely to have behavioral disorders. They're 5 times more likely to live in poverty, and they are 9 times more likely to drop out of high school. And here's this woman, this sociology professor, claiming that the only way to solve racism in our country is to make it illegal for white people to marry white people. Now, I want to mention at this stage that this notion of dividing the world into 2 groups, and you've seen this happen in many different religious systems. Initially it starts off as a self-protective mechanism, but anything that reduces the entire human family to 2 groups, whether it's within Judaism, talking about the Jews and the Goyim, the Gentiles. And initially it starts out just as, it means the nations, but then it becomes a pejorative. It's us and them mentality. You have Christianity training, Christians and pagans, the saved and the damned. You have Islam creating the believers, the Muslims, and the infidels, those who have no faith. You have the Greeks creating a 2-party system, whereas the Greeks and the barbaroi, the barbarians. And initially, barbarian just meant anybody who wasn't Greek. But when you divide the world up into 2 camps, us and them, you got really, really big problems. And so when you now look at a situation that claims there's whites and there's people of color, I have never met a white person in my life, ever. Actually, I have. I've met 2 white people in my life. When I was a child in grade school, I was in a little country school called Rathpecan. There was only about 30 kids in the entire school. And the headmaster was a guy called Sean O'Creadon. And Sean O'Creadon had 2 children who were albinos. Totally white skin, totally white hair, and pink eyes. They're the only 2 white people I've ever met in my life. I'm not a white person. If you look at your camera carefully, I'm some kind of a blend of pink and tan, depending if I've been in the sun or not. In my time in Africa, there were African friends of mine who were much closer in their color, their facial color, than other members of their own tribe. That there's a kind of there's a spectrum on the color. So to divide the color into just 2 groups, whites and colored people, is a tremendous disservice. That is creating racism. That is dividing up the world into us and them. And then we get it compounded a little bit, because there are some people who are really people of color, but that really don't belong to that category anymore because they're very successful. So now they have to be migrated, and sent away from the people of color into the white category. And these are Asian Americans, whether they're Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, or Korean Americans, because they have proved to be so successful in our world. They're brilliant academics. They work really, really hard. They've got great family values. And because they're successful, they must be problematic, because the fact that they're successful means that somehow they're not part of the oppressed. And so we now have to export them and make them part of the white family. This is a mindset that's creating racism and creating a spectrum of victimization. How in God's name can we expect to heal a world in which we divide it into just two categories, us and them, and we're always the good guys and they're always the bad guys? In 2011, I first broached all these topics to the COJ community in a homily I gave in November of 2011, and I called it "Something is Rotten in the State of Denmark." And as a result of that homily, we founded an exploration group that went on for many, many, many years. And we examined a whole bunch of topics: agriculture, ecology, education, finances, medicine, religion, military industrial complex. We examined all these things in great detail. There would be a lecture at the beginning of the month, and then for the next 4 weeks, we would break up into small groups and discuss these issues and research it further. And Bill Miller, who's with us today, and Don Loomis continue that for years afterwards until lockdown put pay to it. Now, very recently, the COJ board of directors, have decided that we need to resurrect this in order that we can provide data and sources for people who are interested in examining all of these issues, the ones I've spoken about particularly today, so that there's room to create lists of resources for people who want to examine all sides of all of these issues. And when we created that list, that study way back in 2011, at that stage, I composed a prayer, and I asked that at the beginning of every session that we use this as a mantra, so that our thinking, is fixated on being healers. So I want to end the lecture part of it right now by reading that prayer for you. I called it the Exploration Group Prayer. I am determined to push beyond fear into love, to push beyond anger into compassion, to push beyond ignorance into knowledge of how the physical cosmos works, to push beyond naivete into wisdom of how the metaphysical cosmos works, to push beyond religion into mysticism, to push beyond the cultural trance into a personal cosmology, to push beyond nationalism into a global community, to push beyond speciesism into love for all sentient beings, and finally, to push beyond earth identification into cosmic citizenship. Namaste. Woke, W-O-K-E, is a new movement which is part of the cancel culture, where people are being deplatformed, censored, where books aren't allowed to be printed, where particular viewpoints on all the important issues are being quashed, particularly by big tech, the Googles, the Facebooks of the world, the Twitter accounts of the world, the Apples, unfortunately. Amazon is refusing to publish particular books by particular kinds of authors. And so there's a total censorship, and people are being demolished. It's called cancelled. Their reputations are being destroyed by people who are adding nothing, and it's growing out of a movement that started actually way back in the 40s and 50s in France, called Deconstructionism, which introduced particularly into American universities the tendency to claim that everything is only a social construct. There's no actual reality. Our belief systems and our systems of self-government are just social constructs that have been created by some kind of a group who want power, and that they believe nothing. They're tearing everything down. So all the great heroes of the past, the people who have made huge contributions to the evolution of our planet and our civilization, they're now regarded as just, the Abraham Lincolns are being thrown down, and the Thomas Jeffersons are being thrown down. The great heroes of our time and of past times are being destroyed. And the people in charge of setting the agenda are now calling themselves woke, the woke generation, who are now going to tell us what's real and what's not real, who are going to demolish our history and our heroes and give us instead, they're going to level the playing field by destroying everything which has made us great. And the family system is the latest one, and censorship is part of that. So that's what I mean by the woke culture and by the cancel culture. So I hope I've explained to you
Okay.
what the woke mentality is, and it came out of France in the post-war years. People like Derrida, you know, and this nihilist. You're absolutely right. It came from a nihilistic viewpoint. As far as Carl Jung and projections is concerned, you're absolutely right. The book you may be thinking was probably a book called Dreams, God's Forgotten Language by John Sanford, I believe. Was that the book?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So John Sanford was a Jungian analyst and an Episcopalian priest, and was the reason that I actually came to the States to study. I'd been fascinated by his writings for many, many years. And when I was going to be doing postgraduate work, you know, I wrote to him asking him, I wanted to study psychology with a spiritual, you know, flavor to it. And he recommended actually the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, where I wound up, you know, doing my doctorate. And so it was John Sanford's book that I really, really loved. And what I loved was that he was able to take psychology and wed it to spirituality, mystical spirituality, and particularly the parables of Jesus Christ, and unpack them not literally and not even symbolically, but even mystically. So to go back to the notion of projection then, Carl Jung claimed that one of the most important archetypes in the human psyche is that of the shadow. And the shadow, he claimed, is 80% gold. It is 80% unrealized potential and 20%, you know, repressed personal darkness. And instead of, in order to kind of understand who we are, initially we need to project that material out onto others. So we project idealistically onto our heroes and our heroines. Instead of developing their characteristics, we simply watch them on television. And instead of dealing with our dark material, we project it onto other individuals, and therefore we're going to have interpersonal conflict with them. Or as cultures, we project it onto other cultures, in which case we're going to create all kinds of prejudices. Or we project it as a nation, and we're going to create propaganda and war. Or we do it as an entire species, and we're going to do it, you know, we're going to create what I call a malignant tumor on the etheric body of planet Earth. And I gave the example of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is a huge patch of plastics in the Pacific Ocean, because of the gyroscopic nature of the tides gathering all the debris from East Asia and from Western America. And so it becomes really important then that we examine our own shadow material so that we can reach our full potential by looking at the pieces that we haven't, you know, fully developed, and by dealing with our own darkness so we don't have to project it onto other individuals or onto other cultures. So that's what Carl Jung was talking about. It's a very important question, and the best answer I can give you is the following. This is one among many issues that concern me at this stage, and it's one of those issues where, again, there's extraordinary censorship. So the exploration group that we're setting up again, I've suggested to the moderators of that group that there be three kinds of foci, three different kinds of focus for this group. That the first one is that they would create a venue so that people can upload podcasts, websites, books, articles, interviews, discussions on all the important issues, including, you know, the lockdown and the COVID and the vaccines. And so I'm hoping that people will contribute from all sides of this equation, and that we will be able to divide into various topics. You know, like whether it's health issues or geoengineering, you know, or 5G, you know, or whatever it is, that will create categories that people can upload stuff that they found useful. Secondly, that we will create a forum for exchange of emails between people so they can talk to each other one-on-one or to the group. And that thirdly, they would create some Zoom meetings for those who want to meet face-to-face until the lockdown is lifted, and perhaps even made, you know, physically present. So I'm hoping that this exploration group will fulfill all those three functions. And for me personally, the first one is the most important, that there be a place where people can safely upload information and sources that they have found helpful in navigating all of these very, very thorny issues. And what I'm asking, I just sent out an email a few days ago to the board and to the moderators, asking that if you want to upload information to such a site, you should say, you know, give the link, you know, say who the presenters are, give a background to them, say what the general topic is, you know, how long does it last? Is it like a 5-minute segment or an hour and a half interview or whatever? Give people a kind of a heads up as to what they may expect. and then let people, trawl through this material and find out what do they want to investigate and how do they want to educate themselves. Because we need to be listening to all sides, and all perspectives on these very important issues. And right now, there is no access to any perspective except that of big pharma and that of the mass media. And the tech giants of Silicon Valley are censoring any other debate on these topics. This group is open to everybody. In fact, Lawrence has sent out emails, and when it's up and running, you'll all be notified that it is now live, and that everybody, those attending this retreat, those people who attend Mass on Sundays, anybody who's interested can become a part of that exploration group. I see that there have always been prophets in our midst, and that latterly some of the great prophets have been writers like Aldous Huxley or 1984. That they've seen what's ahead. Now, if you can go way back and begin to kind of relook at even our scriptural traditions, the Book of Revelation, written about 100 CE, talking about what looks suspiciously like the times in which we're living right now. And so, of course, if you subscribe to the notion, as I do, that time is an artifact of a state of consciousness, and that when you kind of go to different states of consciousness, you have access to all the data from all the time periods, because everything is present in an eternal now. And then you can read the data as really and as easily from the year 2050 as you can from 150 AD. And that some of these great writers and great prophets have had access to that, have had that kind of ability. And they began to articulate. They may not have had all of the details correct, but they had a sense of the trajectory. Because in a sense, once you buy into time, there are 7 different timelines, I believe. This is my own kind of thinking about time. 7 different timelines. There are 2 versions of the past. There's what really happened, and then there's the historical record, because history is written by the winners. So there's what actually really happened, and then there's the record we have of what they chose to tell us. There are 2 versions of the present. There's what's really happening in the world, and then there's the news media, who are making up, a different version, propaganda, or fake news, whatever you want to call it. So there's 2 versions of the present. There are 3 versions of the future. The first version of the future is that it's a fated inevitability, and I don't believe in that. The second version of the future is the probable future. If we continue doing what we're doing right now, this is very probably what's going to happen. And the third version of the future is the possible future, what could transpire if we can see the signs and change what we're doing. And so the great function of the prophet, I believe, the function of the prophet is not to predict the future. It is to prevent the future. That the prophet is somebody who can see the present so clearly that she knows where we're headed, and that it is very, very probable that's where we're going to wind up. And some of these great writers, and it doesn't matter whether they lived 2,000 years ago or 100 years ago, they've seen what the trajectory looks like. They've seen this pattern repeat again and again and again. There's a cyclic nature to history when you begin to see the same cycles happen again and again. And when you see the same pattern begin to emerge, you can begin to figure out where the graph is going. If you've ever seen a sine wave graph and you know how it undulates, and you see the beginning of a graph, you can pretty well guess it's going to be a sine wave by looking at how it's starting off. And so these are people who've been able to peer into the probable future dependent upon our present behavior. And so, yes, the Brave New World, and 1984 and the Book of Revelation, have recognized these cyclical patterns in human history. And we're at a time now when we're at a very, very dangerous stage of a particular cycle. And I'm glad that there are people like you who are waking up and are reading the signs of the time and are gathering data from your own experience and your own friends and putting the pieces of the puzzle together and saying, this is where it's headed. Now we need people who will stand up and be counted, people who will cry out against this censorship, this woke cancel culture, and this kind of mandated mentality, and begin to assert again our First Amendment rights as United States citizens and our freedom as children of God, wherever we live on the planet. and that we begin to shine the light into the dark places, the unexamined, or the kind of the places which have been kept hidden, intentionally kept hidden by some kind of powers that be. So hats off to you, Joe, and anybody who has the courage to stand up and begin investigating what the reality is. Thank you. That's a brilliant question, and I love the fact that you're so au fait with the scriptures. Thank you for doing that. So I see two issues here. The first issue is that, you know, power corrupts, and, you know, great power corrupts greatly. In fact, a very famous Englishman called Lord Acton in 1870, when the Catholic Church was trying to declare an infallible Pope, and he was a Catholic himself, which was unusual because he was you know, almost royalty. But he objected because he says he's the one who created the phrase, power corrupts and great power corrupts greatly. And, you know, the idea of infallibility is really crazy, that any one person, you know, is infallible on speaking of matters of faith and morals. So part of the problem became that a mystical movement started by a great Jewish rabbi who had zero intention of creating a new religion. Jesus Christ, it was the furthest thing from his mind to create a new religion. As somebody steeped in his own wisdom tradition, he wanted to transform what was becoming legalistic and dogmatic into mystical spirituality. And Judaism has made many, many other efforts to kind of transform itself. You know, going from temple Judaism to rabbinical Judaism to the Baal Shem Tov in the 1500s. And so again and again and again, every mystical impulse is going to get controlled or trapped by organization. And I see it going through the following stages typically. You start off with a great charismatic character like Jesus of Nazareth. His teaching is so, you know, appealing that disciples gather around him. That's the second stage. The third stage is the prophet is frequently killed, you know, taken out of the picture by some kind of a threatened oligarchy. The fourth stage is that now the disciples form a community in memory of their dead, you know, prophet. The fifth one is at some stage, if it survives long enough, this community is going to morph into an organization. And the next stage is that self-appointed leaders of this organization will now insist on some kind of orthodoxy. They'll create some kind of a creedal formula that tells you, you have to believe A, B, and C in order to be a member of our group. Now, it's interesting, the great teachers never insist on belief. Never. The word they use is cordo, not credo. Credo means to give intellectual assent. Cordo means to give your heart to. So the great teachers ask us to act from the heart, not to believe with the head. Amen. But the oligarchy will always create an orthodox model, and then they'll persecute people within the system who don't agree with it. And then if they have power, then they'll start, you know, inquisiting and finally leading crusades against the outsiders, the non-believers. And then at that stage, some new great prophet emerges, like Francis of Assisi in the 1200s, to try and call us back into alignment. And this happens in all religious systems. So the first answer to your question is that, left to their own devices, ultimately the spiritual impulse, which starts off as a mystical understanding, morphs into religious dogma. And then when that group gets powerful, they start allying with other powerful forces, secular forces. If they can, they create a theocracy where they have both secular and spiritual or religious authority. And you saw that with Christendom in Europe in the 1600s. You see it in some parts of the Islamic world right now with Sharia law. And so you get, you know, two power mongers allied to each other, and the little people and the mystics get killed in the middle. And so our job is, I don't know if you heard me speak yesterday about a custom in Ireland when I was a child of the mother tending the fire at night and covering the glowing embers with dust, with turf dust. And then in the morning, waking up and blowing on the embers and putting fresh turf in it. And there being houses in Ireland in which the fire was never allowed to go out for 300 years. Wow. Now, that is the place of the mystics. The mystics are the one who jealously guard the embers of spirituality in times of secularization. And we're being called upon to do that in our times. You and I and everybody here obviously have a mystical impulse. Otherwise, we wouldn't be concerned with these kinds of issues. And our job is to blow upon the embers that the previous generations of mystics have held sacrosanct for us, and blow it into flame and add fuel to the fire, so that many, many, many more hearts are set aflame with the love of God. Right. You're absolutely right. And the Bechtel Corporation also was operating in South America. And at one stage, there was an agreement made with one of the South American countries. I'm not certain if it was Uruguay, but one of the South American countries, where it was illegal for citizens to trap water from their own roofs. They had to buy water supplied by the Bechtel Corporation. It was literally illegal. You couldn't put a downspout on your roof and put a barrel under it and collect water and drink the water. It was illegal. So this is what I call economic colonialism, where you come in and you take the resources of a people and you reduce them to poverty. Others of you know of this extraordinary woman, this Indian woman called Vandana Shiva. She was actually a first-rate physicist in the first profession of her life, and she gave it up in order to kind of represent Indian farmers who were being destroyed by crops which were planned obsolescence. So Indian farmers were not allowed to take seeds from last year's harvest and plant them again for next year's crop. They had to buy them every single year from the Monsanto, I believe Monsanto of the world. And so literally tens of thousands of Indian farmers committed suicide because they couldn't feed their families. And this extraordinary woman, who was an internationally recognized physicist in her own right, left the world of physics and devoted her life completely to representing, the impoverished in third world countries who have been taken advantage of economically by these, tyrannical multinationals.